Thank you very much, Minister. And we now invite Mr. Jorge Familiar, who has already been introduced, to make his presentation.
Thank you so much, Minister Clark, ministers, ambassadors, colleagues, partners. Well, I am the Vice President for the Caribbean at the World Bank. I also, at times, look into Latin America. I promise I will keep focusing on the Caribbean, and there is a reason for that. There is a reason for that. Small states, small island states face very particular challenges, challenges that require attention, challenges that require solutions which are specific to their needs. My presentation right now is going to be very easy because I practically need to say that I agree with everything that has been said. In fact, 97% of what I was going to say has already been said. So if this sounds repetitive, it's because it is, no? So first, we are celebrating 55 years of partnership with Jamaica, which is something we are very proud of and very happy of. This engagement has been very deep and in many areas and many fields. But right now, Jamaica, and in particular Minister Clark, is pushing us into new territory and new boundaries. You see, Jamaica is bringing together two key elements for the development of small island states. And Jamaica is changing the way we approach a very sensitive and complex issue, which is environmental resilience. And Jamaica is doing so by bringing together to the conversation also the importance of fiscal resilience. Minister Clark told us that Jamaica is doing very well, and we couldn't agree more. In fact, we commend Jamaica for all the success on the macroeconomic front. But you know, that is because Jamaica has worked extremely hard to be where they are today. This has not been a free lunch. There is an enormous effort by the Jamaican government, by the Jamaican parliament, by the Jamaican people to have moved from where they were just a decade ago, 5 years ago, to where they are today. And that generates an enormous amount of confidence from the international institutions, from the international community on the success, on the future success of Jamaica. And, you know, we need to recognize these efforts. And we need to recognize what it takes to adjust on the fiscal front, as Jamaica has done for such a long period of time. At the same time, Jamaica, as all Caribbean nations, it's exposed to environmental hazards. It's exposed to potential natural disasters. And look, I don't need to tell you what this is about, no? I mean, we all saw it last year. 2 Category 5 hurricanes. One was the biggest, the other one was the fastest forming. In fact, we were in the United Nations having a conference to discuss how we could support the countries that have been damaged by Irma when a tropical storm turned into a Category 1 hurricane. In the middle of the conference, it was a Category 3. By the end of the conference, it was a Category 5. And in the evening, it was on top of Dominica. And in the same 2 weeks, we had 2 earthquakes in Mexico. So you see, this is the environment that, of course, is not climate related, but it's the kind of disasters that our countries are at risk of. So this is the environment. Also, for an institution like ours, who has the mandate to eradicate poverty or support countries in the eradication of poverty, it is the most vulnerable, it is the poorest that are most affected by these disasters. So building resilience needs to be at the center of the development agenda of Caribbean nations. And that is exactly what Jamaica is doing. There has been lots of innovation, thanks to people like Minister Clark that keep pushing us to come up with new ideas and to think outside the box and to come up with new things. So we have created contingent lines of credit for catastrophes. We have created catastrophe bonds. We have created the Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility. So lots of innovation. But the real challenge today is bringing all this toolkit that we have and putting it together with a financial management toolkit. And we talk about resilience as 360 degrees, and I could present it like that. I'm still struggling with the geometric description of resilience. I'm going to try something different. I see it as a task of 3 pillars. One of the pillars is disaster risk preparedness. The other one is building physical resilience, and the third one is building financial resilience or a financial safety net. And then there's a foundation, and the foundation is understanding the risk. The very first step is understanding the risks that we're facing. If we understand the risk, we will be able to put together a comprehensive response to build resilience in all fronts. And we all know that with climate change, the severity of storms is going to increase, and we all know that the frequency of storms is going to increase. The risk matrix is shifting. If things that were going to happen every 10 years are now going to happen every 5, it's going to be very hard to obtain insurance against those. So we will need to build physical resilience to face those risks. But then, if storms are going to be more severe, every 50 or 100 years, there will be some massive events for which we will need a very robust financial safety net. So that is what we need to put together. This also means something that Minister Clark mentioned. If we are going to see more of this, we cannot leave this conversation to chance. And we cannot deal with disasters exposed. We cannot wait until the storm hits and then see how we respond to it. So we need to improve on disaster risk preparedness. We need to monitor more. We need to communicate better, because it's not just the government that needs to understand risks. It's the whole population that needs to understand risks. Look, I come from Mexico. In 1985, there was a very significant earthquake. The official death toll of the earthquake is 5,000 people. Buildings throughout the city fell down. After that, building codes were improved. Civil protection systems were put in place. Communications campaigns went into action. Yearly drills have been taking place. Last year, one of the 2 earthquakes was as strong as the one we had in 1985. And there were tragedies, 350 deaths, but not 5,000. Not so many buildings came down. So resilience was built. So this can be done. And this is part of the agenda. Now, building better also becomes a must. So building physical resilience is going to be key, particularly to face more frequent and not necessarily high severity events. And then we also need to work on our financial safeguards. So on physical resilience, let me share with you how I see the issue. I think that countries, we cannot disassociate the need to strengthen our physical assets with the need to be very prudent on the fiscal front. So if a country like Jamaica is going through a fiscal consolidation process, it's going to be very hard to devote the amount of resources that are needed to build physical resilience in a very short period of time. So it will take time. It is the ultimate solution, but it will take time. The second issue is, how do we go about building physical resilience? I think it's fundamental that countries start thinking about which are the critical assets, and then establishing priorities on which assets need to be strengthened first. And here I think that there are two principles. One of the principles has to be securing human lives, no? Because in the end, what we want to make sure is not lost with a disaster is human life. So thinking, for example, about shelters and having shelters which are strong enough and are readily available before the disaster hit has to be one of the priorities. And then we also need to put, on a list of what are the critical assets and which have to be strengthened and in which order. And then another critical element is going to be crowding in the private sector. Because if we have few fiscal resources and we have an urgent need to strengthen infrastructure, one way to go about doing it is by bringing in the private sector when it is possible. And then there's the issue of the financial safety net. It has to be multi-layered. I think that in order to make costs manageable, the very first steps of this financial safety net have to come from government savings, catastrophe funds that countries create, then contingent credit lines like the one Jamaica is working on with the IDB, and then insurance, risk transfer mechanisms like the minister was mentioning. Here we have one which, by the way, has set an example for the world. It is a global public good which was created in the Caribbean, which is the Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility, which is the first multi-country insurance platform to face environmental risks. So we need to keep strengthening that component. And then working on other mechanisms. One are the catastrophe bonds. We will have time to talk more about those at some point. But then, there's space to think about other things, no? Like, for example, in debt issuances, ensuring the payment of interest in case a disaster hits a country. I would like to just say 2 words of caution on two things. No? One is on insurance, and the other one is on national catastrophe funds. No? So ex-ante losses are deceiving because they are averages, you see? And anyone can drown in 1 meter of water on average. No? And the same happens with ex-ante expected losses. When the disaster materializes, the losses are not 0.4% of GDP on average. They are of 240% of GDP. So you see, insurance matters. Insurance is expensive, and when you pay it, no one is particularly happy of disbursing, but the day you need it, then you understand why you had it. So that is something that countries need to keep in mind and that the population needs to understand. And the second one applies to disaster funds. And here we need always to apply a principle that I call the lead us not into temptation principle. You see, countries start saving and funds start accumulating and the disaster doesn't happen. And then temptation kicks in. Why don't we use this money to, pay for the improvement of this or for this payroll or to expand this other thing? And then the disaster hits and you don't have the resources. So I do think that these 2 principles need to be sort of like cast in stone when it comes to the financial safety net. And then finally, I think that there is a very important role to play for the international community in support specifically of Jamaica, because they have done the homework, but they are exposed. And between today and the day in which Jamaica will be able to invest more strongly on building physical resilience, the international community, in my opinion, should lean forward and support Jamaica in covering on the financial safety net front. Thank you very much.